Rick Ross just got caught doing the one thing Rick Ross swore Rick Ross would never be caught doing. And the picture is so bad, so unflattering, so painfully human, that even the people who used to ride for Rick Ross went silent the second the photo hit the timeline. And no, this is not another Drake feud recap. This is the story of how a rapper who spent 20 years selling the illusion of untouchable wealth just accidentally revealed a crack in the vault. And the sound you are hearing right now is the entire hip-hop internet peeking through it in real time. Buckle in, because by the time this video is over, the way you see Rick Ross is not going to be the way you saw Rick Ross this morning. And I promise you, none of the other breakdowns you have watched this week have connected the dots the way we are about to connect them. Let me set the scene, because context is everything here. It is a random weekday in 2026. Rick Ross is somewhere between Miami and a business trip that Rick Ross himself has bragged about 100 different times on 100 different podcasts. Custom jet, $40 million bird, G600 interior, bed installed, painted to spec, the whole aviation flex. Rick Ross has built an entire brand around that jet the way other people build a brand around a debut album. It is the logo. It is the flex. It is a receipt Rick Ross carries every time somebody dares to question the size of the empire. Rick Ross has said it on Drink Champs. Rick Ross has said it on $1 million worth of game. Rick Ross has said it on morning radio, on afternoon radio, on The Breakfast Club, on Rap Radar, on every corner of the internet, where a man with a microphone will let a man with a chain talk. And then, out of nowhere, a photo drops. Rick Ross, in an airport, in a plastic seat, in a terminal chair that looks like it was designed to punish lower backs. No entourage, no security, no assistant floating 3 feet behind holding a passport and a bottle of water. Just Rick Ross, looking like a regular passenger waiting on a boarding call in a country that, based on the tile pattern alone, is not New York or Los Angeles. And the internet did what the internet always does. The internet zoomed in. The internet cropped. The internet made memes before the pilot even filed a flight plan. Within an hour, the joke had a name. Within 2 hours, the joke had a soundtrack. Within 4 hours, the joke had a Drake lyric attached to it. Because the Drake stands, the most feared subculture in modern music, went digging through Iceman like archaeologists on a caffeine drip and pulled out a single line. If I am lying, I am flying economy. That was it. That was the match. And once the match hit the gasoline of the Rick Ross airport photo, the whole thing detonated across every timeline that matters. TikTok caught fire. X caught fire. Instagram Reels caught fire. Even Threads, a platform that barely catches anything, caught fire. By the time Rick Ross woke up the next morning, the meme was already older than the news cycle, and Rick Ross had a decision to make. Now, I need Rick Ross fans to hear me out for a second, because there's a version of this story where none of this matters. Regular human beings fly commercial every single day. There is no shame in a plane ticket. There is no shame in a boarding pass. Millions of people would kill to be able to afford a first-class seat, let alone a private jet with bed in the back. So on paper, this is a nothing burger. On paper, this is a Tuesday. But we do not live on paper. We live on the algorithm. And on the algorithm, image is currency, and Rick Ross just wired the wrong wire transfer to the wrong account. Rick Ross did not just fly commercial. Rick Ross flew commercial after 20 years of selling audiences a version of Rick Ross, where flying commercial was mathematically impossible. That is the crack. That is the leak. That is the moment the illusion tapped the microphone and asked if it was still on. Here's where it gets really interesting, and here's the part nobody else is telling you the right way. The airport photo is not the scandal. The airport photo is the symptom. The scandal is what Rick Ross did next. Because a smart Rick Ross, a disciplined Rick Ross, the Rick Ross of the Teflon Don era, would have said absolutely nothing, would have let the meme age like milk, would have let the news cycle chew on it for 48 hours and then move to the next thing, because the next thing is always coming. Instead, Rick Ross grabbed the shovel. Rick Ross started digging. Rick Ross posted a response, then another response, then dropped an explanation about Starlink, then dropped a comment about Trick Daddy in Colombia, then dropped another quote about flying economy on purpose, then dropped another interview about being paid before the album drops. Every single sentence out of Rick Ross's mouth in the last week has been a shovel of dirt on top of a hole Rick Ross voluntarily jumped into. Every clip, every clap back, every laugh a little too loud on somebody else's podcast. All of it, dirt on the shovel, dirt in the hole. And you can hear the panic behind the confidence if you know what to listen for. Rick Ross keeps repeating one line in every interview. My album is number 12. I am already paid before the album comes out. I am already paid. Already paid. Already paid. When a man tells you 3 times in one sentence that a man is already paid, it is not the flex it sounds like. It is a pre-written excuse. It is the mental armor a man puts on before a battle. A man is not sure a man is going to win. Rick Ross is telling the world the numbers do not matter, because Rick Ross is quietly worried the numbers are about to matter more than ever. That is not confidence. That is a hedge. And once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. Play any Rick Ross interview from the last 30 days back to back. Count how many times Rick Ross says paid. Count how many times Rick Ross says already. The pattern will scream at you. Now let me connect it out that most channels are refusing to connect. Because most channels are scared of the Drake stans, and most channels are scared of the Ross diehards. Rick Ross moved the release date of Set in Stone. Rick Ross pushed the album back by an entire month. And the timing of that push lines up almost perfectly with the release week of Drake's Iceman. Rick Ross claims the delay is about rollout, about vinyl, about physical copies, about the ritual of dropping on the 17th. Fine, take Rick Ross at his word. But the polymarket traders, the same traders who bet on elections and Oscars and Super Bowls, are sitting at 100% confidence that Iceman is holding number 1 for at least 4 straight weeks. 100%. That is not a bet. That is a verdict. And Rick Ross, a veteran of the game, a man who has been reading the streets and the charts for 20 summers, understands exactly what those numbers mean. Rick Ross pushed the album because Rick Ross does not want Set in Stone to be the sacrificial lamb on Iceman Week. That is not a diss. That is not shade. That is arithmetic. And Rick Ross did the math. But here is where the story bends into something bigger than an airport chair and an album delay, because this is not really about Rick Ross versus Drake anymore. This is about the collapse of the luxury rap operating system. For an entire generation, the deal between the rapper and the audience was simple. The rapper sells a fantasy, and the audience buys a dream. The chains, the cars, the jets, the mansions, the champagne, so cold the label peels off. Rick Ross was the CEO of that fantasy. Rick Ross narrated it. Rick Ross scored it. Rick Ross put it on wax and shipped it worldwide. The whole point of a Rick Ross album was to make a listener feel like a boss for 45 minutes on a commute. And the boss is not supposed to be in seat 27B. The boss is supposed to be in the sky, above the clouds, above the taxes, above the traffic. The airport photo did not just embarrass Rick Ross. The airport photo threw a rock to the stained glass window of luxury rap itself. And the whole cathedral is now holding its breath, waiting to see how many more windows are made of the same fragile stuff. And Rick Ross knows it. That is why every recent interview sounds like Rick Ross is auditioning to be Rick Ross again. Listen to the language. Rick Ross keeps talking about Rome. Rick Ross keeps talking about Egypt. Rick Ross keeps talking about pyramids and things that last 200 years. Rick Ross is not naming the album Set in Stone because Rick Ross thinks Set in Stone is a good title. Rick Ross is naming the album Set in Stone because Rick Ross is quietly terrified the legacy is written in wet sand and the tide is coming in. There's a desperation in the branding this cycle that was never there in the Teflon Don era. Back then, Rick Ross did not need to remind anybody Rick Ross was a boss. The suits did that. The cars did that. The room did that. The wine cellar did that. The 7 mansions and the John Deere tractor with air conditioning and tinted windows did that. Now Rick Ross has to say it out loud. 3 times per sentence, into every microphone Rick Ross can find. That shift is not vibes. That shift is data. Now let me address the Drake side of this, because I know somebody in the comments is already typing. Drake did not create the airport photo. Drake did not push the album back. Drake did not tell Rick Ross to fly commercial. Drake wrote 1 line on 1 song on 1 album, and Rick Ross walked directly into the trap Rick Ross claimed was not there. That is what elite lyricism does. Elite lyricism plants a seed that reality waters. If I am lying, I am flying economy is not a diss on its own. In a vacuum, it is a throwaway bar. But paired with a real-life Rick Ross airport photo, in a real-life terminal, in the middle of a real-life feud, that bar becomes prophecy. And the prophecy is now a meme. And the meme is now a genre. And the genre now lives on TikTok, X, Instagram, Threads, and every group chat where 2 or more hip-hop fans have ever texted the word Miami. But listen closely, because this next part is the part that separates my breakdown from every other breakdown floating around this week. There's a hidden villain in this story, and the hidden villain is not Drake. The hidden villain is not Rick Ross. The hidden villain is the modern rollout itself. In 2026, an album is no longer a piece of art. An album is a content stress test. Every artist over 35 is being asked to fight a war on 20 different fronts. Streaming, bundles, vinyl, TikTok snippets, podcast rounds, rage bait clips, beef management, meme insurance, airport optics, girlfriend optics, jet optics, watch authentication, chain authentication, fake diamond accusations, real diamond receipts. It is a full-time job, and it never ends, and it never sleeps. And Rick Ross, God bless Rick Ross, is trying to run a 2010 playbook in a 2026 stadium. That is why every misstep looks louder. That is why every airport chair looks like a coffin. That is why every Drake bar lands like a laser-guided munition. The game changed underneath Rick Ross's boots, and Rick Ross is still trying to sell records the way records used to be sold, back when the streets were the streets and a physical copy meant something. And there is one more layer, and this is the part one I have not seen a single commentator touch. So pay attention. The airport photo would have been survivable. The album delay would have been survivable. Even the Drake economy bar would have been survivable in isolation. What is not survivable is the pattern. Because when you zoom out, this is not one bad week for Rick Ross. This is a slow drip, over 18 months, of tiny moments where the Rick Ross fantasy did not quite match the Rick Ross footage. The lawn tractor confession, the AC in the tractor confession, the watch authentication drama, the chain skeptics on Twitter, the Miami jeweler quote about iced out rose and fake diamonds, the interview where Rick Ross laughed too hard at a question about being broke, the photo with the security detail was suspiciously absent, the clip where Rick Ross's engineer allegedly could not sit through the Drake album for more than an hour. Each moment on its own is a nothing moment, but strung together in a highlight reel, they tell a story. And the story is not that Rick Ross is broke, because Rick Ross is very obviously not broke, but the story is that the myth is aging, and the myth is starting to sweat under the studio lights, and the myth cannot outrun the timestamps anymore. So where does this leave Set in Stone? Let me tell you exactly what is going to happen, and you can quote me on this in a month when the numbers hit. Set in Stone is going to do respectable numbers. Not great, not terrible. It will chart. It will stream. It will find a home on somebody's Sunday Drive playlist. But Set in Stone is not going to beat Iceman. And Set in Stone is not going to shift the culture. And Set in Stone is not going to be the moment Rick Ross reminds everybody why Rick Ross was ever the guy. It is going to be a solid album from a legacy artist in a genre that has stopped rewarding legacy. And Rick Ross is going to spend the next 6 months telling every podcast that the streets loved it, that the real ones felt it, that the numbers did not matter, that Rick Ross was already paid. And every single one of those interviews is going to feed the meme instead of killing it. That is the trap. That is the loop. And Rick Ross keeps walking right back into the middle of it, chair by chair, terminal by terminal, quote by quote. Now, let me pull the camera back all the way, because there's a lesson in this story that goes way beyond Rick Ross, way beyond Drake, way beyond one photo in one airport in one country. The lesson is this. In 2026, you cannot outrun your own timeline. Every rapper, every celebrity, every influencer, every brand is walking around with 20-year archives strapped to their back, and the internet has infinite time to cross-reference every single sentence you have ever said against every single sentence you say next. Rick Ross bragged about it yet. The internet remembered. Rick Ross bragged about being untouchable. The internet remembered. Rick Ross bragged about being the biggest boss you've seen thus far. The internet remembered. And when a single airport photo lands, the internet does not see one photo. The internet sees a receipt, next to a receipt, next to a receipt, next to a receipt, and the math finally does not add up. That is the world Rick Ross is trying to sell an album in. That is the world every single one of us is trying to build a brand in. And Rick Ross is a case study, live, in real time, whether Rick Ross likes it or not. So the next time you see a headline about Rick Ross being broke, remember that Rick Ross is almost certainly not broke. The next time you see a headline about Rick Ross ducking Drake, remember that ducking is a strong word for a man who has been on 100 podcasts in 3 weeks. The next time you see a headline about Set in Stone flopping, remember that flopping in the streaming era is not the same thing as flopping in the CD era. But also remember this. Rick Ross is not fighting Drake. Rick Ross is fighting a new version of the internet that did not exist when Rick Ross became Rick Ross. And the internet does not care about Rome. The internet does not care about Egypt. The internet does not care about pyramids. The internet cares about the last thing you posted and the next thing you are about to post. And Rick Ross keeps posting and keeps posting and keeps posting. And every single post is another chair in another terminal, in another photo, in another meme, in another cycle that Rick Ross is no longer in control of. And that is the real story here. Not the flight, not the album, not the feud. The real story is control and the loss of it in a genre and an era that used to be defined by the illusion of total control. Rick Ross used to be the human embodiment of that control. Every bar, every ad-lib, every photo op, every yacht, every cigar. Now the control is slipping one micro moment at a time, and the audience can feel the slip even when the audience cannot name the slip. That is why the airport photo hit so hard. Not because the chair was ugly, not because the terminal was small, but because for the first time in 20 years, Rick Ross looked like Rick Ross was not the one directing the shot. Somebody else was holding the camera. Somebody else was choosing the angle. Somebody else was picking the caption. And once the audience realizes the artist is no longer directing the movie, the audience starts writing a new movie in the comment section in real time, and the artist becomes a character in a story the artist did not sign up for. And let me leave you with one uncomfortable question, because this is a question every commentator this week has been too scared to ask out loud. If Rick Ross, arguably the most consistent luxury rap brand of the last 2 decades, can be knocked off center by a single airport chair and a single Drake bar, what does that say about the rest of the roster? Because if the wall is that thin for Rick Ross, the wall is thin for everybody. And there's a short list, a very quiet short list, of legacy artists sitting at home right now watching the Rick Ross news cycle with the sound off, praying that whatever cursed algorithmic energy is chasing Rick Ross this month does not turn around and start chasing them next month. Because the internet is not a fan base anymore. The internet is a search engine with a memory and a grudge. And once the search engine picks a target, the search engine does not blink for 6 to 8 weeks. Rick Ross is currently the target. Somebody else is next. And the short list is a lot shorter than most legacy artists want to admit in public. That is the ambient anxiety hanging over hip-hop in 2026. And Rick Ross is a smoke signal announcing it whether Rick Ross meant to or not. And before you close this tab, let me hand you the mental picture that ties this whole video together. Imagine right now a split screen. On one side, a young Rick Ross, chain on the chest, cigar in the hand, next to a Maybach, ad-libbing about the biggest boss you have seen thus far. On the other side, a 2026 Rick Ross, in a boarding area, next to a stranger with backpack, scrolling a phone that has unread messages from a manager asking for a statement. That is a whole story in one image. That is a 20-year arc compressed into one frame. And once you have seen it, you cannot unsee it, and neither can Rick Ross, and neither can the algorithm. Tell me in the comments where you land on this one. Are you Team Rick Ross? Ride or die. Set in Stone is going to shock the world, and the airport photo is a nothing story blown out of proportion by bored Drake fans with too much free time? Or are you Team Reality Check, where the airport chair is a symbol, the album delay is an admission, the interviews are a hedge, and the boss era is quietly ending in slow motion right in front of us? There is no wrong answer, but there is a real answer, and I want to hear yours before the numbers drop. And if this breakdown gave you a single new angle on the story that the other channels have not touched yet, do me one favor. Hit that subscribe button, tap the bell, share this with the one friend in your group chat who still refuses to admit that luxury rap is on life support, and come back next week, because I am telling you right now, the second Set in Stone hit streaming, the second Iceman posts week 2 numbers. This story is not ending. It is only just now getting to the good part.